Who was the deadliest gunfighter of the Old West? I get this question all the time, and to be honest, there's really not a simple answer. In all reality, most of your well-known figures, guys like Wild Bill Hickok or John Wesley Hardin, they've all got a certain amount of legend or lore that's built up over time. Not only are their exploits often exaggerated, but even their own autobiographies are comprised mostly of tall tales. So with that in mind, what you're about to hear is not a comprehensive guide to every verifiable kill from the Old West, nor is it meant to be the definitive answer as to who was the deadliest gunfighter. This is just my humble attempt to share some information and hopefully have a little fun in the process. By the way, I do want this to be interactive, so if there's someone who you think shouldn't be on the list, sound off in the comments. The only catch is, if you take someone off the list, you have to replace them with somebody else, and you have to say why. And make sure you stick around to the very end, because I do have a bonus gunfighter that most people have never even heard of. Alright, so without further ado, coming in at number 10 is the notorious Johnny Ringo. I'm probably going to get a lot of flack over this, but reputation notwithstanding, Ringo only had one confirmed kill over the course of his entire life, and that was prior to his arrival in Tombstone. You see, back in the day, Ringo got involved in a dust-up in Texas known as the Mason County War, and it was during this period, in late September of '75, that he rode up to the home of Jim Chaney and filled him full of lead. Ringo would be arrested and even indicted for murder, but ultimately released on account of witnesses refusing to testify. Now, there are stories of Ringo being involved in additional killings there in Mason County, but according to historian and Ringo biographer David Johnson, there is zero actual evidence proving as much. Nothing more than unverified rumors and anecdotal stories. He would shoot someone else once he got to Arizona, a guy by the name of Lewis Hancock, but per contemporary sources, Hancock was merely wounded as opposed to being killed. According to the December 14th, 1879 edition of the Arizona Daily Star, quote, "Last Tuesday night a shooting took place at Safford, in which Lewis Hancock was shot by John Ringo. It appears Ringo wanted Hancock to take a drink of whiskey, and he refused, saying he would prefer beer. Ringo struck him over the head with his pistol and then fired, the ball taking effect in the lower end of the left ear and passed through the fleshy part of his neck. A half inch more in the neck would have killed him. Ringo is under arrest." End of quote. So yeah, if the newspaper is to be believed, Hancock was alive and well, or at least semi-well, at the time of publication. There are also many who think that Ringo was simply trying to pistol whip him when his gun went off on accident. Now, by the summer of 1882, things really weren't going all that well for Mr. Ringo. Not only was he drinking heavily, but he also started acting more and more erratic, to the point that he would even publicly predict his own imminent demise. The last person to see him alive was Billy Breckenridge, who would later state that Ringo was very drunk and reeling in the saddle. And yeah, just a couple of days later is when his body was discovered. Feet wrapped in an old shirt, pistol still in hand, and a bullet through his temple. So how many people did Johnny Ringo truly kill? It's impossible to know for certain, but so far as the evidence is concerned, it was just two. That old boy over in Texas, and then sadly, himself. Coming in at number 9 is Butch Cassidy. Originally from Utah, Butch got his start at the tender age of 14 when he burgled a store for a pair of pants and a slice of pie. Burgled. That's like saying that word sometimes. It makes me feel dirty, but I don't know, kind of in a good way. Now, for the most part, Butch earned an honest living as a cowboy, or at least he did before embarking on a series of train and bank robberies. Eventually, the heat got so bad that he and his buddy Sundance had to lamb chop it to South America. They played it cool for a while, but I guess the lure of easy money was a little too hard to resist. Sure enough, they soon reverted back to their old ways, started robbing payrolls down in Bolivia, which, as fate would have it, is how they wound up surrounded by Bolivian authorities in 1908. There was a brief gun battle, during which either Butch or Sundance, we don't know which one for sure, shot and killed a soldier. And then, during a lull in the fighting, a scream was heard coming from the boarding house where the bandits were holed up, followed by 2 gunshots and silence. When the soldados finally worked up the courage to investigate, they found both men dead. Turns out Butch had put the wounded Sundance out of his misery before pulling a Johnny Ringo and turning the pistol on himself. And yeah, believe it or not, despite spending the better part of 2 decades as an outlaw, Butch Cassidy never killed anybody until that last tragic day in Bolivia. Coming in at number 8 is Clay Allison, a gunfighter so crazy that he got kicked out of the Confederate Army for being quote-unquote maniacal. He was also a bit of an exhibitionist. You see, Clay had this habit of stripping down to his birthday suit whenever he got drunk. Hell, on at least one occasion, he even got into a gunfight while wearing nothing but a smile. He was also a very active participant in New Mexico's Colfax County War, during which time he was rumored to have killed several of his rivals. That said, we can only verify 3 of them: Chunk Colbert, Pancho Grego, and Charles Faber. Now, do I personally believe that Clay Allison only killed 3 people? Not really. Remember, he did serve during the Civil War. He got kicked out, as I mentioned, but he did manage to re-enlist. He was also rumored to have taken part in quite a few lynchings, as well as a couple of fatal knife fights. But much like the rumors concerning Johnny Ringo, there's just not much in the way of proof. At number 7, we got Henry McCarty, aka Billy the Kid. Now, you may have heard that Billy killed 21 men, 1 for each year that he was alive, but as it turns out, the real number is much lower. In fact, so far as the evidence is concerned, Billy was only responsible for killing 4 men. Just 4. Wendy Cahill, Joe Grant, Bob Ollinger, and James Bell. Now, that said, he did participate in the deaths of several others, like Buckshot Roberts and Sheriff Brady. He also took part in the Blackwater Massacre, as well as the killing of James Carlisle. Only thing is, we don't know for certain who fired the fatal rounds. It may have been Billy, or it may have been one of his compadres. Or in the case of Carlisle, it may have just been that posse from White Oaks. Look, Billy the Kid was a very dangerous young man, especially when cornered. I'm certainly not trying to take that away from him. All I'm saying is that he wasn't exactly going around stacking as many bodies as legend suggests. But then again, who was? Coming in at number 6, we've got Jesse Woodson James. Born in Missouri in 1847, Jesse was thrust into a life of violence during the Civil War when he was still a teenager, riding with the likes of Quantrell and Bloody Bill Anderson. This is a very volatile period there in Missouri. It truly was brother against brother and neighbor against neighbor. And Jesse almost certainly took part in a whole hell of a lot of killing, including the Centralia Massacre. In fact, it was Jesse, just barely 17 years of age, who allegedly delivered a coup de grace to Major Andrew Johnston. But be that as it may, his actions post-war only involved 1 verified kill, that of train conductor William Westfall, the operative word being verified. Jesse was also rumored to have killed Pinkerton operative Joseph Witcher, as well as his former neighbor Daniel Askew, and even his own gang member Ed Miller. And while we can't definitively prove that Jesse pulled the trigger, I do think it's likely. There were also people killed during the course of robberies, like banker John Sheets, but once again, and much like Billy the Kid, we can't say for sure who dropped the hammer. So yeah, while it's thought that Jesse James likely killed around 20 people, we can only verify less than a handful. Everything else is pure speculation. At number 6, we got the legendary Wild Bill Hickok. Believe it or not, despite Hickok being rumored to have killed hundreds of men, the real number was more like 6 or 7. And that's not just my opinion, by the way. That's according to historian and all-around Hickok expert, Joseph Rosa. Now, like many of the others on the list, Hickok did fight in the Civil War. But once again, it's impossible to know how many people, if any, he killed during the course of his service. You gotta think, there were over 3 million people who fought in the war, both sides combined. And there were only around 700,000 deaths, most of which were caused by disease or infection, as opposed to direct combat. So, while it's certainly possible that Hickok was some type of an Old West Civil War Rambo, just riding around and dropping rebels left and right, there's just not really any evidence to back it up, especially considering that a good deal of his service was spent as a provost marshal. Now, as far as Hickok's verified kills, all but one would take place after the war, the most famous of which was his duel with Davis Tutt over in Springfield, Missouri. He took down a pair of drunken cowboys in Kansas, as well as an unruly soldier, and finally, in 1871 is when he killed Phil Coe. And then, ironically, just moments after killing Coe, he accidentally gunned down his own friend, Mike Williams. And yeah, that would be the last time Wild Bill ever took a life. He'd depart for Deadwood a few years later, and the rest is history. At number 4, we got another legendary lawman, Bass Reeves. Born a slave in the late 1830s, Bass would escape from bondage during the Civil War and seek refuge in what's now Oklahoma. Skip ahead to 1875, and he'd become one of the very first black deputy U.S. Marshals west of the Missouri River. And he'd continue working in law enforcement for the next 3 decades, during which time he made over 3,000 arrests and at least 14 verified kills. Last of which came in 1907, when a damn near 70-year-old Bass helped protect the town of Muskogee from militant anarchists. Not making this up. And by the way, if you're curious to learn more about Bass Reeves, including his fight with the anarchists and whether or not he was really the inspiration for the Lone Ranger, I do have a 2-part series on the man. Matter of fact, I've got an episode on almost everyone on today's list. Links down below. But yeah, although Reeves is rumored to have killed over 20 men, there is only about a dozen or so that are verifiable. Either way you want to shake it though, Bass was most definitely not someone you wanted to tangle with. At number 3, we've got the extremely creepy Deacon Jim Miller, also known as Killer Miller. A man so vicious, he was said to have murdered his own grandparents. Turns out that's not true, but he did kill his own brother-in-law, which, in my opinion, ain't much of a crime. He also happened to be a devoted Methodist. That, along with his signature long black coat and aversion to alcohol, garnered him the nickname of Deacon. Now, Miller would eventually find work in Texas as a deputy, or at least he did before murdering his own boss, Sheriff Bud Frazier, and then embarking on a very long career as an assassin for hire. In fact, there are some who think that it was Miller who killed Pat Garrett. That said, and despite being credited with somewhere between 20 to 40 kills, the actual verified number, so far as I can tell, is just 6. Do I think that's an accurate number? No, I do not. The thing about Miller is that he operated mostly in the shadows, and many of his victims were oftentimes disenfranchised. Hell, by Miller's own admission, he killed so many Mexicans along the border that he lost count. He was also suspected and even arrested for multiple murders, but just wasn't sufficient evidence for a conviction. At the end of the day, nobody can say for certain how many people that Miller killed, whether it's 20 or 40 or somewhere in the middle, but I do think he had a few more bodies to him than we can prove. There were just too many people that went missing when Miller was in the vicinity, just to chalk it up to coincidence. Coming in at number 2 is Tom Horn, a man who once claimed that killing was his specialty and that he had a corner on the market. Born in Missouri in 1861, Tom got to start out west scouting for the Army. He also dabbled in ranching, fought in Cuba with the Rough Riders, and worked as both a Pinkerton and range detective, which is basically just a nice way of saying that he was a hired killer for the wealthy ranchers. His downfall came in 1901 when he allegedly gunned down a 14-year-old named Willie Nickel. And then, after a possibly coerced confession, Horn was convicted and hanged by the neck until he was dead, just one day shy of his 42nd birthday. Now, while there is a legit argument to be made as to whether or not he really killed Willie Nickel, what's not up for debate is that Horn was a stone-cold killer. Only question is, how many people did he really kill? It's worth noting that Tom was involved in some pretty heavy fighting against the Apaches. But as tends to be the case during firefights, it can be very difficult to ascertain who did what. There were even rumors in Arizona that he and his boss, Al Sieber, were just going around indiscriminately killing Native Americans in their downtime. He was also a participant in the Graham-Tewksbury feud, during which he allegedly, there's that word again, allegedly assisted in a few extrajudicial lynchings. And then, of course, he got his career as an enforcer for the big outfits up in Wyoming. And much like Jim Miller, Horn did the bulk of his killing in secret. All total, he's thought to have taken around 17 lives, and that's after you strip away all the tall tales and anecdotal stories. 17. That's serial killer numbers. And to be completely honest, I really wouldn't be all that surprised to find out that he killed a few more that we just aren't aware of. Finally, coming in at number 1 is a fellow Texan, John Wesley Hardin. If you're not familiar, Hardin's the only guy on the list who was rumored to have killed someone just for snoring. He's also one of the few who was never an outlaw, at least not in the traditional sense. Hardin never robbed any trains or banks or anything like that. He was just really good at killing, and he seemed to enjoy it. Killed his first man when he was just 15. Then a couple weeks later, he gunned down 3 soldiers sent to arrest him. In his own words, quote, "I waylaid them as I had no mercy on men whom I knew only wanted to get my body to torture and kill. It was a war to the knife for me, and I brought it on by opening the fight with a double-barreled shotgun and ended it with a cap and ball 6-shooter. End of quote. And yeah, on it went for about the next decade. From Texas on up to Kansas, and even as far east as Florida, Hardin left a trail of bodies wherever he went. Or at least he did until being sentenced to 25 years in the Huntsville State Penitentiary. Believe it or not, he would actually get a law degree while behind bars, and he even opened up his own practice after he was released. Just not for very long. Hardin soon sank back into his old ways and got killed by Constable John Selman over in El Paso on August 19th, 1895. As far as his official body count is concerned, Hardin himself claimed to have killed over 40 men, which, okay, maybe, but from what I can tell, only about half of those are verifiable. Keep in mind that these deaths all took place over the course of less than a decade, from roughly the fall of 1868 all the way up to his arrest in 1877. So we may not be able to prove that Hardin killed as many men as he bragged about killing, but the fact that he gunned down around 20 people in such a short amount of time, without even being a member of law enforcement or an outlaw or even a veteran of the Civil War, is mind-boggling. It's also how you're in the #1 spot. Now, like I said earlier, today's list is not meant to be a comprehensive end-all be-all of the deadliest gunfighters. I just thought I'd have a little fun and try something new. In all reality, there were a ton of killers back in the Old West, men that most people have never even heard of. Guys like Tom Tobin or Mark Dugan or Whispering Jim Smith or even Dallas Studenmeyer. Truth is, most of your well-known gunfighters, like a lot of the guys we mentioned today, Jesse James and Wild Bill and Billy the Kid, their fame is largely due to having best-selling books and movies made in their honor. Meanwhile, you had quite a few very dangerous men who just sort of fell by the wayside. I'll give you a great example. Here's your bonus gunfighter, Captain Jonathan R. Davis, who, so far as I know, is not related to the lead singer of Korn. I did an episode on Davis a very long time ago, but long story short, he and 2 other prospectors were ambushed by road agents in present-day Placer County, California, way back in 1854. And despite both of his companions being killed almost instantly, Davis managed to pull his revolvers and gun down 7 of the attackers. And then when he ran out of ammo, he charged in head first with nothing but his Bowie knife, killing an additional 4. That's 11 men dead in about as much time as it took for me to tell the story. And yes, there were witnesses. Another group of miners heard the shots and came to investigate, and they actually found Davis rendering aid to the surviving outlaws. But there's no movies made about him, so he's mostly forgotten. But what do you think? Sound off in the comments and let me know your opinion. Who would you have added to the list, or who would you have taken off the list, and why? Did I mention anyone who you think is overrated, or should I have also included guys like Wyatt Earp or Doc Holliday? And what about the Native Americans? You know, guys like Geronimo or Crazy Horse or even Quanah Parker. How deadly were they compared to the more well-known gunfighters? I am genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. Also, let me know if you think you'd enjoy similar content, like maybe a top 10 list of the deadliest Old West boomtowns, or the top 10 gunfights of the Old West, or something like that. Now, before you go, I do have a very quick favor to ask, and this only applies to those of you watching on YouTube. I never say this, but you would be doing me a huge favor if you like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Like I said, I very rarely ask people to subscribe, and matter of fact, I don't think I've ever asked for anyone to hit the notification bell. But unfortunately, YouTube is currently being flooded with a ton of low-effort, AI-generated nonsense. You know what I'm talking about. We've all seen the videos, and it's occurring pretty much across the board in every single genre you can imagine. And as a result, you got actual humans like myself or Brandon over the history of the OK Corral just falling by the wayside. Unfortunately, the algorithm is far from perfect, and as long as YouTube is making money off of AI, they're going to continue flooding our feeds with a bunch of artificial bullshit. I can't tell you how many people over the course of the past year have asked me where I've been. I've been right here. In fact, I've been putting out more videos than ever before. You're just not seeing it due to your home feed being inundated with artificial garbage. And the only way I know to cut down on this is to subscribe and turn on notifications for channels that you actually enjoy. Also, probably wouldn't hurt to select the not interested or don't recommend channel options if you do spot anything that's AI generated. So yeah, on that note, I guess that's about all I've got for today. Thank you so much for joining me, and until next time, adios.